So jumping into chapter 21 this week, we find that the promise is finally fulfilled, right? We're so excited. Baby Isaac is born. The promise has been fulfilled. Now, if you think about what that really means, that the promise was fulfilled, we might have a little bit different stance on our own faith in God's promises, because they had to wait 25 years, roughly around 25 years. If you look at the different dating in when Ishmael was born and different things like that, from the very first time he promised it to Abram, it's been about 25 years. And you can imagine that probably after year 2, year 3, you would feel like this probably isn't going to happen. Year 5, year 10, year 15, year 20. I mean, 20 years for me, I feel like is definitely a limit. Like, okay, God, whatever reason you're not doing what you said, I still love you, whatever. But 25 years later, God finally fulfills the promise. And I think that sometimes we can get weary in waiting. And Sarah and Abram had to wait 25 years for the promise to be fulfilled. But God was faithful. And so we see that Isaac is born. And then there's the story of Hagar and Ishmael. And Ishmael's now making fun of Isaac or what have you. But the point is, Sarah says, no way. We waited 25 years for this baby, for this. Now he's about 3 years old because he's being weaned. We waited 25 years for this to happen. This other unpromised kid cannot get in the way. He cannot get in the way. This is God's promise. Get her out of here. Get Hagar out of here. Get Ishmael out of here. And we see that Abraham at first is grieved. That's his son. I mean, you got to imagine that he was probably, a teenager at this time, Ishmael was. So he's been in his life. He's been with him. This has been the only son he's had. This would be hard to hear. But he knows that Isaac is the child of promise. And when God reminds him of that and says, no, do what Sarah says, he's finally lets go, and he says, hey, listen, if God fulfills his promise 25 years later, I'm going to do what he says. And so we see Ishmael and Hagar kicked out of the home, and they are out on their own. And this is the thing that I actually want to focus on today, is so many times we focus on the Isaacs and the promises, which are great. God is good at those, and we do need to focus on that. But what the thing is that God sees everyone, every single one of us, wherever we may be. We may have been brought into poverty. We may have been brought into wealth. We may have been brought into abusive homes. We may be brought into wonderful homes. Wherever we are, God sees us. He sees you. He sees me in the midst of whatever. And he saw Hagar. And so Hagar runs with her child. He's about to die, right? And you see that God meets her right there. And then it says that God helped raise him up, and he found a wife and what have you. He became a great archer. And so the thing that I think about, though, is that Hagar had to make a choice to follow God too. When we talked about her previously, she ran away, and God says, go back, because this is it. If she would have ran away back then, not according to God's way, not according to God's promise, she still would have been a slave. She would have had nothing. She would have left with nothing. She wouldn't have been provided for, and she would have been a runaway slave. She wouldn't have quote unquote rights. But because she was faithful and did what God said, now when Abraham had them leave, he didn't make them leave as a runaway. He gave them the blessing. He freed her. He said, go on your way. You're out. You're done. You're not in our camp. And so now she could live as a free woman. Before, she would be a runaway slave. She'd be looking over her shoulder. She wasn't released legally, quote unquote. But now God made a way for her to be free and her son to be free, just like he promised. She said that he would be a wild donkey of a man, right? And we thought, oh, that's a weird saying. But the reason that was because wild donkeys were free. And so they got their freedom because they followed God's promises in their own lives as well. And so wherever you may be, whatever situation you may be in, maybe you're in a really rough situation or a good situation or whatever it may be, God sees you right where you're at. And he has a plan for you too. He had a plan for Hagar. He had a plan for Ishmael. They weren't the one that he had for the line of lineage of Jesus, but he still had a plan for them. And sometimes I think we see people that do great things, and we see people that do not as big or showy things, but God has a plan and sees them all. He sees you, he sees me, and he will provide for us, and he is faithful. So today, wherever you find yourself in the midst of that, maybe you're Isaac and Sarah, Abraham and Sarah and Isaac, maybe you're Hagar and Ishmael, but God sees you and he has a plan for your life. Come back next week for chapter 22.